You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hi, I'm Emily MacLeod and I'm a PhD researcher at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. In this season of Research for the Real World, we want to highlight research that examines how we can recruit and retain more teachers. This is because we know that teachers are a key influence upon young people's attainment and outcomes, but currently, teacher shortages are one of the main challenges faced by education systems in many countries, including here in England. On this episode, I'm delighted to be talking to Dr Asma Benhenda. Asma is a research fellow at the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities here at IOE. Her research applies economics to the field of education, and her work focuses on inequalities and social justice and considers how policies can be used to improve educational outcomes. Asma joined IOE in 2020 after completing her PhD in France at the Paris School of Economics. Her PhD focuses on teacher policies, especially in relation to teacher retention. And not only did she complete her PhD, but she also wrote a book to disseminate the main findings of this research to the wider public, which received extensive media coverage across France. Asma's current research focuses on the issue of teacher shortages and the consequences of these shortages for young people living in disadvantaged areas. She also researches pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, and she teaches economics both here at IOE and in Paris. Asma is also our first ever returning guest to the podcast. For those of you playing at home, she appeared in our season 14 episode about her work with Dr Jake Anders about early intervention programs for children and young people in West London. Welcome back to the podcast, Asma.
Thank you for having me back.
So before I ask you a bit more about your work now, so perhaps briefly to recap, what is your own educational background and how did you come to be involved in working in education research?
Basically, I'm kind of a pure product of French meritocracy in some way because I benefited from really good education in France as an undergrad. And then I went on to do the French Grande École program, which is kind of the very selective program in higher education in France. And then I was doing my studies, I had like the benefit of having access to great researchers at École Normale Supérieure, and that was what prompted me to want to do research. So I started as an intern during my master's, doing research assistant jobs, and the few first projects I worked on were on school segregation in the Paris region. And so I was working on how can we have like some form of like positive discrimination programs to reduce school segregation in France, which is a really big issue. I think it's a bigger issue in France to some extent than in London, when there is some social mix and some school segregation is not as big as it is in Paris, where we have like really deprived area, what is called like the banlieues, who are really struggling. And
is this segregation by like social class?
So it will be like parental income, social class. So we studied like this type of programs and found that they were quite successful in kind of like reinforcing the French meritocracy in a way that basically it was about enable really high achieving pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds to access much better high school. So that was one of the results. And this type of research really resonated with me in some way personally. So I would be like really keen to continue to work on this area, which was really important for me. So I continued to work on this as a master student, and then as a PhD student, I shifted a bit away from school segregation issues to work on teachers, because there were like a really good opportunity to work on this, because French Ministry of Education released like really new data on teachers. There were no data on teachers before that was studied. So like the topic of my PhD, I had like a hosting agreement with the French Ministry of Education, and point of my PhD was to like explore this new data set. So it was like a lot of data work. Like it took most of my PhD to do this, to like understand how the data was structured, to clean it, etc. And the main paper that I spent the most time on during the PhD was about teacher absences. So it's a big issue. I know it's also a big issue to some extent in the UK, because you have all the literature on teacher burnout, etc. So teacher absences from like a pure teacher health and well-being perspective is important. And also it's important because it's not evenly distributed across the country. And especially one of the findings of my PhD is something we already suspected but didn't have really robust evidence on, is that most absences are really concentrated in disadvantaged areas where you have a lot of short but repeated absences from teachers. And these,
Oh, yeah, that was going to be my next question. Are they short absences or long-term absences?
like long absences, like long-term illness type of absences, kind of like not that prominent in disadvantaged schools, because the teaching population is quite young by construction. So it's mostly like disadvantaged schools. It's mostly like short absences from teachers who are missing 1-2 days a week maximum. The issue is that because the paper I wrote was about like teacher substitution, so like the issue with this is that basically it's really hard to find supply teachers for this. Like it's really difficult to replace these absences. So in the end, they are more harmful that long-term absences that are planned in advance, when you can have the time to find a replacement and a quality replacement. And so that was the one of the results of this paper. And the other one was that does it actually like hurt students to have teacher absences? And the answer is yes, even if it's not, the magnitude of the effect is not like huge compared to other determinants of pupil achievement, but it is still something that is causing a lot of disruption in schools, and is mostly an issue in the sense that it's like hard to staff areas which are mostly disadvantaged. So it is one of the many factors that contributes to educational inequalities.
Yeah, thank you. That's so fascinating because teacher shortages are really like it's a common topic. Everyone knows that we need more teachers, but I think teacher absences isn't something that's widely talked about or known about. And clearly, the impact of that can be huge, as you say. So, thank you for sharing that. As someone who was a French teacher myself and has studied in France, I'm interested to know as well what your experience has been working in education research in France and then coming to England and working in that area there. Are the two similar, or how have you found like English schooling as well and learning about English schooling compared to France?
Yeah, I think the main difference, as you probably can expect, is I think the French educational system is much more centralized than the system in the UK, especially with like the push toward academization of schools. I think is going to be more and more the case that the English school system is quite decentralized. The hiring of teachers is completely different. Like teachers are hired like individually by schools in England, whereas in France it's an algorithm that assigns teachers.
Oh, so more like I think like doctors in England, it's more like that then. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it does look like the doctor system, like NHS system, in the sense that you become a civil servant when you graduate from, like, you get your teaching certification, and then you automatically, like, you get a job. You don't have to worry about getting a job, so you have this full job security.
So, as you know, Asma, in this season of Research for the Real World, we're highlighting research that looks at teacher recruitment and retention in the context of teacher shortages. And this is my own area of research too, so it's something I'm really interested in and why I wanted you to come back on the podcast. So, we know that teacher shortages are an issue in a lot of developed countries. Could you start by telling us how England compares to other countries in terms of teacher shortages?
Yes, so teacher shortages is an issue in most countries, developed and developing countries actually. But if we focus on developed countries, England is kind of like slightly above average in terms of teacher shortages compared to other OECD countries, and its shortages like concentrate as in other countries mostly in STEM subjects. So the main issue in England, as in most other countries, is to recruit STEM teachers, math, physics, etc. teachers, because these teachers, one of the many reasons why it's so difficult to recruit them is that people in STEM topics usually have higher, better outside options in terms of wage in particular. So that makes it.
Yeah, and we should say here that STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, maths. Yeah.
So yeah, science, technology, engineering, and math teachers are quite hard to recruit and to also keep. Like they have a high attrition rate, like meaning they tend to leave the profession more frequently than other teachers.
And how does England compare in terms of how we treat teachers? Is that part of why that we have like more shortages in this country, do you think?
I think it's an open question. I think there's still research on whether like working condition in England compared to other countries. It does seem that from existing research though that teachers seems to be more prone to like mental health issues and more likely to have lower job satisfaction than in other countries. But it's hard to know what are the exact like causal determinants and what causes this. It's true that there are challenges in the education system in terms of working condition and pay. In particular, these are the main points that are raised in surveys when we ask teachers like, how do you feel about your job? They mostly complain about pay and working condition, relationship with the management of the school is also something that comes up. So these are areas to explore in order to know better how to improve teacher retention in England and also in other countries.
And because of your expertise in France as well, I got the impression from something you said earlier that France also faces teacher shortages, even though it sounds like there are quite big differences in terms of how teachers are recruited into the system. So, is that true that France also has a shortage of teachers, and is it also in the same subject areas?
Yeah, so France has also a big shortage of teachers. The issue is less about teacher retention though, because the teachers have a different status in France. They have civil servant, so it's kind of the teacher like the issue is less big than in England in the sense that you don't have this attrition rate, but it's also might be also because of data limitation, because we don't see them like actively leaving the teaching profession in France. But what they might do is that they might go on secondment in other like civil service profession, and that also might something that is kind of worth of exploring. It hasn't been explored to my knowledge so far so much in France, but that's just like some obvious thing we can think about to analyze teachers in France. But it's true that the status of like civil service in France kind of like prevent this like major teacher attrition that we can observe in England. That would be the main difference. But in terms of recruitment, it's the same story. So recruitment in France is through a competitive exam, but the thing is like it's theoretically competitive, but because there's not enough candidate, it's not really competitive at all. It's in a sense that they don't manage to fill all the slots of this competitive exam, so they are really struggling. It's a big debate in France. To some extent, I feel bigger than it is in the UK for some reason. I feel like in France there is really some form of panic about how are we going to find math teachers. So what they do is that they hire contract teachers. So contract teachers are like on fixed term contracts, and they are here to fill positions where they are not able to recruit teachers. The issue is that these contract teachers don't have the same training and screening than other teachers, and I have done some research showing that contract teachers don't perform as well as actually like proper, maybe a bit extreme, but there are some evidence that contract teachers don't perform as well as permanent teachers, probably also because they don't receive, not because of their intrinsic quality, but just because they don't receive training. They just hired on the spot most of the time compared to permanent teachers. So that's a big issue.
Yeah, and of course, all of this kind of becomes a negative impact on the students in the school.
Yeah, all of this is an issue for several reasons. And one of them is because it kind of contributes to the whole problem of educational inequalities, because the students and the pupils who are faced with those issues, with the issue of teacher shortages and the issue of having contract teachers rather than permanent teachers, are not the students in advantaged areas, because these areas are quite attractive and they manage to attract experienced teachers who are like keen to live there, and when they're there they stay. But it's more like the hard to staff schools, the disadvantaged schools in the poor areas of the suburb of Paris, for example, that struggle a lot to keep their teachers. And this is why it's a big policy issue. It's not only about the teacher as like human resources issue, it's more a bigger issue than human resources issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I've been aware of doing my PhD during the pandemic is how the pandemic maybe changed teacher shortages in the UK. So, I wanted to ask you to tell us a bit about how the pandemic changed those patterns and whether it changed kind of the root causes of the issues facing recruitment and retention. Like, did the reasons why people aren't staying in teaching and why people aren't going into teaching, did they change because of the pandemic?
So what changed during the pandemic is basically like outside options changed to some extent, right? The whole economy was shut down, so there were some like change in what people who could do in terms of jobs, so that kind of like pushed some people toward teaching, but because there were less outside options. But obviously the economy is back to almost normal now, even if we are in a recession. So it has, this effect has been like temporary, and at least early evidence that suggests that the boost in teacher recruitment that was observed during the pandemic, like the heart of the pandemic years, what has like kind of faded out, and we can't really rely on this to solve the teacher shortage issue anyway, because it's only one or two cohorts of teachers, and that's not enough to solve these issues that has been structural for almost like more than a decade now.
Yeah. And of course, the people who went into teaching during the pandemic, we can guess some of them might not stay in given the recruitment, the retention patterns.
Yeah, exactly. And also an issue that has been created. So the structural issues of low competitive pay and difficult job conditions hasn't changed. It's just that the external option has changed temporarily. And also what's important to be aware of is the fact that it seems that, at least from the recent surveys that has been conducted during the pandemic and in the early post-pandemic years, it does seem that this preliminary evidence suggests that teachers' working condition have become actually worse post-pandemic. There is like this big issue that we are going to face for like the next decade, which is the learning loss of pupils that was accumulated during the pandemic years. And it's a massive tax that teachers have to perform, and it's a massive challenge they have to face. And it's hard, it's really hard to do this in the difficult, for teachers who are already working in difficult working conditions. So that an additional reason to care about teacher well-being and teacher retention is because we have this massive issue of the teaching, of the learning loss, the pandemic learning loss, that also has disproportionately impacted disadvantaged pupils.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just sounds like something that could have had the chance to improve because of the pandemic might have actually got worse. You've reminded me of something that Alison Peacock, the head of the Chartered College of Teachers, said at the start of the pandemic. I remember it really stuck in my mind about people with children at home thinking, "Oh, teachers do wonderful jobs. I'm so impressed because this homeschooling is really difficult." But also this kind of flip side of thinking, "Oh, be good when schools reopen because I get like my childcare back," and that kind of flip side of teachers do such a wonderful job, but also we need them so that we can get on with the other work that like perhaps the more important work in some people's eyes. Absolutely. So,
Mm.
turning more to your own research, I know that you've done a lot of work about how we might improve teacher shortages. So, which policies do we know are or can be effective in addressing this issue of shortages?
So I think it might not be a popular opinion in terms of potential like recession and public like austerity, but as an economist, it's kind of like obvious that the most obvious way to improve the attractiveness of the job is to just improve the relative pay and to make it more competitive. So I think that there is strong evidence that the teacher recruitment is really sensitive to the pay. So it does improve the teacher recruitment to increase teacher wage. So there is like for this, I think the evidence is really clear, and the issue is whether there is enough money to do it or political will or whatever you think is more important. But that actually is an important result. I think the value for money, if you think in the long term of having a better teacher, is actually a strong argument in the favor of investing in the teachers. The thing is, like, you might not see the impact of this immediately. That's always the issue when you talk about education policy, actually, because education is a really long process. It does take a lot of time to actually reap the benefit in terms of economic returns, right? Like, you will see immediately pupils improving. For this to have an actual economic returns in the economy, it might take a bit more time. So that's one of the issues when we talk about educational policy. So the value for money need to be considered in the long term, with long-term outcomes for which teachers are proven to have a big impact on also non-cognitive, like not only test scores and labor market outcomes, but also in terms of well-being and non-cognitive outcomes. So that's important to highlight. The second policy, which is kind of related to the pay policy, is also like giving financial incentives to teachers to teach in specific, like if we don't want to increase everyone's wage, at least one policy that might work is to increase the wage of the teachers that are more difficult to recruit, especially teachers in science, in hard science topics. So that has been done, and we have a paper with one of my colleagues, Sam Sims, where we look at this and see that it does work to have this like teacher incentive schemes which were implemented in England, and I think now were like cut back and now are back to the latest I've heard. So I think that's good news that they are considering them again. And the thing is, it is actually better to manage to retain teachers. So I think it links to the question you were mentioning about whether retention or recruitment. I think it's actually in terms of value for money, it's actually better to be able to retain teachers and to keep them rather to have always to recruit new ones, because also teachers learn a lot on the job. That's something that there is a big literature and a lot of evidence on. So when you lose an experienced teachers, you lose more than it's kind of hard to replace them. It's kind of intuitive in any jobs is like this, right? When you lose an experienced staff, you have to get an inexperienced one that don't have the same skills as the one that you actually.
And it's going to take a long
Yeah, that
time to train them up to the
exactly,
same level, of
lot
course.
of time and
Yeah.
resources to train them back. So then basically it's kind of wasted resources to have teachers that you learn of the job, they learn on the job, and then they leave once they are kind of trained and ready to be in the classroom. It's a lot of less of resources. So focusing on retention is also really important. So these are like in terms of financial aspect of the job. In terms of non-financial aspect, to be honest, in economics, we don't have as much evidence, probably because the data is not as straightforward to analyze as the more like usual data on wages, etc. So, but there is like so there is evidence that teacher on the job training helps for retention, then also improving the school, the culture at the school, the working culture at the school is really important. So these are obviously, we think about this like it's true for any job, and I think it's even more important for a job that is based, it's a really like in the sense like it's a passion, like teachers teach also, they care about monetary aspect, but they also care a lot about non-monetary aspect, maybe more than the average worker. So that's why it's kind of really important to think about this working culture, etc. at the school. There is also an issue of head teachers also turnover. That's also an issue that hasn't been explored so much by the economics literature, but it's also important to think about the head teacher also as being part of the story of how to improve teachers' working conditions.
Yeah,
Yes.
because they have the power to change that culture a bit more, which, as you spoke about, must be important. And also, you'd think that just in the general like knowledge of wider society, head teachers are automatically paid a bit more. So it might not necessarily, if they've stayed in that long and are comparatively well paid for their profession, it seems more to do with the culture, but perhaps with them. That's really interesting. And yeah, I appreciate, I think, as I found in my own research, that this recruitment, like keeping people in the profession and recruiting new people, are quite different topics, and they're often grouped together, and they have the same problem. They both cause teacher shortages, and some of them are to do with the same issues like pay, as you say. But yeah, I think it's important to kind of separate, as you did. That really makes sense. And can I ask how you found out about those pay and the financial incentives longer term? How do you know that that makes an impact? Is it through surveys of existing teachers?
The issue of like relationship between teacher pay and teacher retention. So basically, to do that, we used like administrative kind of human resources data from the Department for Education. So what we do is just basically we try to compare like in the most like comparable way. So it's a lot of like challenges, empirical challenges into like identifying like the causal impact of this specific issue. But basically, we try to find other schools that are and other teachers that are as comparable as possible to the teachers who have received these incentives, and we try to see whether those that have received these incentives are able to do they actually stay longer than those that haven't. So this is basically the method that we have implemented, and that has been implemented in the in other papers on the wider issue of teacher pay.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That seems like a really obvious way to do that research. As someone who mainly uses like interview data and qualitative data, that seems like a really fascinating way, and I look forward to learning more in the future as well. So, one of the things that I wanted to ask is that because being a teacher is something that if you've been to school, lots of people know about or think that they know about. So I wanted to know if outside of policy, if you think that there's anything that the wider public or other areas of society or policies in areas that aren't governmental might do to improve teacher shortages, because it seems like something that affects all aspects of society, right? Not just policymakers.
Yeah, I think that's a really really interesting point you're raising. I think the issue is that there is a general view of teacher that might be not accurate and maybe like misrepresent the importance of teachers in society. And I think that's one of the things that contribute to teacher shortages. Like I think that if they were if the view of teachers were different, maybe more people will be keen to do teaching and will not be put off by it. I think that's one of the difficulties, that there's this view of teacher that is not aligned with the actual role and the actual contribution to society. And I think making people aware through the research you and I and other people are doing of how basically teachers are really the bedrock of education. There is no education system without good teachers. So if you don't have teachers, you don't have education, and if you don't have education, like how does society like stay together? So that's also something that I think is really important to highlight, and to get the message across is important.
If you don't have teachers, how does society stay together? I feel like we need that like, on the wall. That's a great. That's a great quote. So we're coming to the end of our discussion, sadly, Asma. But before I finish, I wanted to ask you what's next for you. So it's been great to hear about your research in terms of teacher shortages in England. But what else are you working on, or what are you hoping to work on in the future?
So I have a project that's funded by the Nothing Foundation, which is related to the issue of teachers actually, because it focuses on special education needs pupils and how did they manage to go through the pandemic, and how they came on the other side of the pandemic in terms of educational outcome. And also one of the objectives of this project is also to see to what extent the resources that were existing pre-pandemic, did them to what extent they help the pupils with disabilities to go through the pandemic. And one of the most important resources, obviously, is the teachers, right? So it's about how can we help more this section of the pupil population who is really struggling a lot in normal times, and how can we help them also overcome all the difficulties that the pandemic has created in the long run.
Oh, fascinating. I wish you all the best with that. Thank you so much, Asma. It's been really interesting to hear more about your research, but also your career, and especially your interest in kind of this policy level at trying to make real world improvements in this issue that we know faces both the English education system, French education system, as you said, and many others. So thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You can follow Asma on Twitter at Asma Benhenda. That's ASMABENHENDA to learn more about her research. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, we have an archive of 18 past seasons. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts to find episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. And a quick favour before you go, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show. And that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing about such important work. I'm Emily, thanks for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.